Jim Ross might look like a man who spends his weekends competitively slow-cooking ribs, but behind that Oklahoma drawl is a brain that's clocked more wrestling carnage than a Vietnam medic. And while old JR was known for screaming himself hoarse, calling everything from Mankind's plummet off hell in a cell to Stone Cold Steve Austin flipping Vince the Bird, there were some wrestlers who made him wish he'd stayed home and opened a damn diner instead. This is the story of the 5 blokes who pushed Jim Ross to the edge of sanity. The ones who made him contemplate trading his hat and headset for a loaded shotgun and a bottle of bourbon. Spoiler alert, these aren't misunderstandings. JR's dislike was about as subtle as a chainsaw through a piñata. We're talking lazy workers, egotistical maniacs, and people who made Vince McMahon look like a humanitarian. And no, Ultimate Warrior isn't on the list because even Ross would probably just have written Ultimate Effin' Nightmare and called it a day. This list goes deeper, into the truly personal grudges, backstage betrayals, and pure, unfiltered hatred. Grab a JR's BBQ sauce bottle, use it as holy water, and let's dive into the beautiful, brutal car crash that is Jim Ross's top 5. If Jim Ross had a nickel for every time Ahmed Johnson injured someone, or himself, he'd own half of Texas. To JR, Ahmed wasn't just a sloppy wrestler. He was a walking OSHA violation, wrapped in baby oil and anger issues. Signed in 1995, Ahmed looked like a superstar, jacked up, intense, charismatic. If you liked your charisma, sweaty, and confused. But when the bell rang, holy hell. Watching Ahmed work was like watching a forklift fight a trampoline. According to Jim Ross, in several shoot interviews and his Grilling JR podcast, Ahmed was dangerous and uncoachable. Ross has said on his Grilling JR podcast in 2019, you could tell Ahmed what to do, but once he got out there, it was like his brain just left the building. During a match, Ahmed once injured Davey Boy Smith by stiffing him with a clothesline so hard that somewhere physics professors cried. He later went on to injure himself slipping off the ring steps. While walking, JR allegedly lobbied backstage to either send Ahmed for retraining or just glue him to a chair until the bell rang. The backstage consensus was that Ahmed had the emotional range of a Labrador in a thunderstorm, but Ross was especially vocal. Behind closed doors, Ross basically said Ahmed was a liability lawsuit in boots. Vince McMahon, being Vince, kept pushing Ahmed because he thought he looked like money, ignoring the minor detail that Ahmed couldn't wrestle for toffee and had all the promo skills of a GPS with a low battery. It all came to a head when Ahmed started showing up late for events, openly refused to improve, and treated JR's advice the way a cat treats a glass of water. Knock it over and walk off. When Ahmed was finally released in 1998, it said that Jim Ross popped a bottle of something expensive and laughed so hard he needed oxygen. Jim Ross dealing with Buff Bagwell was like trying to explain quantum physics to a drunk seagull. After WCW folded like a cheap tent in 2001, WWE picked up some contracts, including Buff's, and within 2 weeks, JR hated Buff so much he probably considered changing his own name just so he didn't have to be associated with the man. On Grilling JR, Jim Ross explained that Buff showed up late, acted like a diva, and even got his mom involved. That's right, Judy Bagwell, the only human being who has ever been suspended above a wrestling ring on a forklift, was calling WWE headquarters to defend her boy. Ross said, "I thought it was a prank call. Nope, that was Buff's mom telling us he needed a lighter schedule." Buff had all the humility of a man who's just snorted pure ego. He thought he was a major star, ignoring the fact that WCW in 2000 was about as popular as syphilis at a swingers party. Jim Ross had to be the one to fire Buff Bagwell personally, an act he described as an absolute pleasure in his autobiography. Bagwell responded by crying backstage, saying he was too young to be treated like this, a sentence so pathetic it could cause spontaneous nosebleeds. Ross, never one for diplomacy when sufficiently pissed off, basically told Bagwell to grow a pair and handed him his pink slip. Even years later, when asked about Buff, JR simply said, he was a cancer to the locker room. And considering WWE locker rooms have featured actual criminals, that's a hell of a burn. If you ever wondered why Jim Ross sounds angry when mentioning Sable, it's because he had to babysit the world's angriest supermodel through a wrestling career she didn't even want. Sable became WWE's breakout diva in the late 90s, and with it came an ego bigger than Yokozuna's dinner tab. According to Ross, Sable treated most backstage officials like they were dog crap she'd accidentally stepped in. JR said on Grilling JR, she was hard to manage. She didn't want to be a wrestler, didn't want to be around wrestlers, but wanted to be the star of the show. When Sable filed a $110 million lawsuit against the WWE in 1999, citing unsafe working conditions. JR damn near needed a blood transfusion. He was so furious. Ross was personally involved in talent relations and described the experience of dealing with Sable's lawyers as trying to staple water to a tree. It wasn't just the lawsuit. Sable would show up late, refuse to do promos she thought were beneath her, and openly sneer at wrestling fans. You know, the people buying her bloody action figures. JR, who has the patience of a saint in most cases, once ranted, "You want to be a star? Fine. You just don't do it by shitting on the business that made you famous." When Sable finally left the WWE, before crawling back years later after Brock Lesnar defrosted her ego, Jim Ross is rumored to have said, "Good riddance," and meant it with every fiber of his cowboy-hatted being. Now, don't get it twisted. Jim Ross helped discover Brock Lesnar. He saw him suplexing trees in Minnesota and thought, "There's my future megastar." But by 2004, JR wanted to suplex Brock straight into a volcano. Brock Lesnar's WWE exit was so acrimonious, it made JR physically sick. After Ross spent years pushing, coaching, babysitting, and metaphorically wiping Lesnar's oversized baby butt, Brock up and quit because he didn't like the travel schedule. Also because Vince wanted him to feud with a midget, but that's another trauma for another day. Jim Ross said, "I took it personally, I believed in Brock, I thought we were building something, and he pissed it away for nothing." Lesnar's last match in 2004 was a stinker against Goldberg that fans booed out of Madison Square Garden harder than Hulk Hogan booing a restaurant bill. Ross said Brock leaving WWE was like being stabbed with a hot poker, and in case anyone missed the sarcasm, he later added, he was more interested in playing football, and he wasn't even that bloody good at it. When Lesnar tried out for the NFL, it was reportedly Ross who laughed hardest when he failed to make the team. "Good luck playing tackle dummy," he said, probably while opening another bottle of something strong. You know what's worse than a drug-addled, arrogant, self-centered jerk? A drug-addled, arrogant, self-centered jerk who's also your top star. By 1995, Shawn Michaels was so unbearable that even Mother Teresa would have punched him square in the mouth. And Jim Ross, bless his battered soul, had to manage him. Ross said bluntly, "Shawn, during that period, was a miserable son of a bitch. Coked up, bitter, politicking harder than a Tammany Hall gang, HBK treated everyone, from jobbers to legends, like they owed him rent money." JR detailed how Michaels openly sabotaged other wrestlers' pushes, refused to lose cleanly, and turned every production meeting into a hostage negotiation. Once, when asked to put over another wrestler, Michaels allegedly responded, "Why don't we just have him pin God too?" This from a man who once literally teamed with God in a storyline. Ross admitted that while Shawn later redeemed himself, the mid-90s version was like working with a live grenade that hated your guts. One particularly brutal story: after losing his smile and vacating the WWF title, HBK handed over the belt to JR backstage with the care of a man tossing a dirty diaper at a stranger. JR supposedly bit through his own lip to keep from punching him. By the time Michaels retired the first time, Jim Ross had aged approximately 17 years. Imagine showing up to work every day knowing you had to deal with a barely literate human battering ram, a grown man crying over his mom's phone calls, a diva who thought wrestling fans were lice, a future UFC fighter with the loyalty of a fruit fly and a high as a kite diva tearing up the locker room. Jim Ross didn't just survive wrestling's ugliest backstage dramas, he thrived through them. Like a stubborn cowboy refusing to drown, he called it straight, fought his battles, and somehow didn't strangle a single idiot, a testament to either his willpower or his access to very strong whiskey. So next time you hear "Bah, God" from commentary, just remember, behind that Oklahoma drawl was a man who once took a chair shot straight to the soul 5 times and still showed up to work. Bless you, JR, you magnificent suffering bastard. Thanks for watching. Lord Alfred Hayes, the Queen's emissary to the madhouse known as the World Wrestling Federation. A man so British, he'd probably wiped his feet before walking into a locker room. He showed up to WWF with the posture of a royal corgi and the voice of a man narrating tea commercials, and then proceeded to spend the next decade secretly hating half the roster. Not because they were villains, but because they were uncouth buffoons who made him question the future of the industry. Now, here's the real kicker. While Hayes looked and sounded like dignity in a tuxedo, behind the curtain he had more twisted rib stories than a barbecue joint. Ask Roddy Piper, who once wrote that Hayes approached him butt naked, swinging his junk like a hypnotist's watch and calling out, "Hot Rod," like it was foreplay. It was like watching Roy Rogers trying to lasso Dale Evans. Roddy Piper in the pit with Piper. Hayes laughed. Piper did not. In fact, young Roddy, who was just 15 when he got into the business, said the incident left him rattled enough to confront Vince McMahon about the WWF's backstage culture. And this wasn't an isolated story. Multiple sources say Hayes had a go-to prank where he'd ask rookies to close their eyes and hold out their hands, only to drop his family jewels into their palms like it was a Christmas surprise from Buckingham Palace. So yes, Lord Alfred may have loathed the cartoonish disasters prancing around him on screen, but off-screen he wasn't exactly the patron saint of professionalism. He hated stupidity. He hated sloppiness. And apparently he hazed like a fraternity reject with a Downton Abbey accent. This video isn't here to make excuses for Lord Alfred Hayes, but it is here to roast the 5 wrestlers he couldn't stand in the WWF, the ones who made him grit his teeth, tighten his cravat, and wish he was back in England teaching bad actors how to fall down gracefully. Make some noise for the Mountie, Jacques Rougeau, everybody. The only man to ever cosplay as a Canadian cop and somehow still look less intimidating than a mall security guard on Xanax. This guy walked around yelling, "I am the Mountie." Like that meant something. Dude, you're not a Mountie. You're a stripper who got lost on the way to a bachelorette party. I've seen tougher people in Sesame Street. If Canada ever needed to surrender to someone, they'd send this guy to the front lines just to confuse the enemy into a ceasefire. Jacques Rougeau had all the intensity of a guy asking if you've heard the good news about French-Canadian traffic laws. He carried a cattle prod like it was supposed to make him scary. Bro, it's not intimidating if you shock people after you've already pinned them. That's not wrestling, that's electrocuting the unconscious. Even Jeffrey Dahmer's watching like, yo, chill. And backstage, this guy had more heat than a hot yoga studio in July. Got punched out by Dynamite Kid and cried to his dad. The only time this guy won a fight was in catering when someone dropped a baguette. He wasn't a locker room leader. He was a locker room lesson, as in, don't be like that guy. Lord Alfred Hayes watched the Mountie and probably thought, this is why Canada should have stayed part of the Empire. The Mountie wasn't a heel, he was a hallucination. If stupidity wore a uniform, it'd look just like him, red, shiny, and absolutely full of crap. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Brutus, the Barber Beefcake, the only man in wrestling history to turn a pair of scissors into a career. And I mean that literally. If it weren't for Hulk Hogan, this guy would have been cutting coupons, not hair. Brutus Beefcake looked like if Fabio fell down a flight of steroids. This man was so plastic, I thought Hasbro made him. His ring gear screamed, "I'm here to wrestle," or host an underground Chippendales show in a Florida swamp. And that mullet? Jesus. You know your haircut's a war crime when even Lord Alfred Hayes, a man who wore velvet in the summer, looked at you and said, "How uncivilized." Let's talk about the gimmick. A barber? Really? That's not a wrestling character. That's a plan B after you fail out of beauty school. Brutus would win a match, then give his opponent an unsolicited haircut like a cracked-out Edward Scissorhands. Imagine losing to a guy who looks like he got dressed in a strip club blackout, then waking up with a fade worse than his promo skills. Backstage, the only thing Beefcake was known for was being Hogan's human fanny pack. You couldn't find him on a card without checking Hogan's waistband. Lord Alfred Hayes, a man who believed in skill and legacy, probably looked at Brutus and thought, "What's this tosser doing in the ring, other than making it dumber by standing there?" Brutus wasn't over. He was carried. By Hogan, by gimmicks, by luck. The only thing he ever cut was the credibility of the mid-card. To paraphrase Lord Alfred Hayes, he couldn't wrestle his way out of a salon. Make some noise for Bad News Brown, and the only wrestler whose gimmick was being visibly pissed off that he has to be here. This guy looked like he punched mirrors before brushing his teeth. Lord Alfred Hayes couldn't stand Bad News Brown, not because he was tough, but because the guy walked around like he just got cut off in traffic for 15 straight years. Hayes was all about class, poise, storytelling. Bad news? His whole ring psychology was, what if a mosh pit had hands? And let's be clear, this wasn't just in-character heat. Bad News hated everybody. He called out Hogan for being fake, Andre for farting in his face on a bus, and the WWF for being too white. Which, let's be real, he wasn't wrong about. But Hayes? Alfred was the embodiment of British restraint, and Bad News wrestled like he was trying to end polite society. Backstage, Bad News Brown acted like every conversation was a threat. The dude had more beef than a Texas barbecue. Hayes once referred to him as uncultured, which is British for, I wouldn't invite this man to a funeral, let alone a match. Bad News was the kind of guy who'd slap your tea out of your hand just because it was chamomile. His finisher? The Ghetto Blaster, a name that aged like milk in a sauna. Alfred probably heard that and said, "Good heavens, is this a wrestling match or the soundtrack to a mugging?" The guy was so grumpy, even Lord Alfred, a man who wore cravats and gave heel commentary with manners, wanted to hit him with a thesaurus and tell him to calm the hell down. Bad News wasn't a bad guy, he was just bad company, and Alfred had no time for a man who wrestled like a felony in progress. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Nails, the only wrestler who sounded like he swallowed a cheese grater and screamed through a sock full of battery acid. This guy didn't cut promos, he left voicemails for Satan. Let's talk about the gimmick. Vince handed us an actual criminal in a bright orange jumpsuit and said, "Trust me, he's going to be huge." And sure, he was, in mugshots. Nails looked like the guy at the bar who tells you he's not that kind of felon. He didn't wrestle, he lunged. He moved like he was trying to shank the canvas for snitching. Lord Alfred Hayes saw him and said, "Good heavens, someone call the authorities." No, the real ones. This man got into the business to play a convict and left the business because he acted like one. He actually assaulted Vince McMahon, choked him out. You know how bad you have to be at faking violence to end up committing the real thing? Nails didn't just burn bridges. He pissed on them, poured gasoline, and threatened to sue the Ashes. His run was so short, the only thing lower than his win-loss record was his SAT score. And let's not forget, his whole "I hate the big boss man" feud was built around prison abuse. That's right. Nails got on national television and yelled, "He touched me!" in a voice so distorted it made Kylo Ren sound like Liberace. To Lord Alfred Hayes, this wasn't wrestling. This was witness protection with pyros. He wasn't a monster heel. He was a walking court summons. Nails wasn't cut from the cloth. He was yanked out of the evidence locker. Give it up for Iron Mike Sharp, Canada's answer to the question, what if a broken foghorn had anxiety? This man didn't wrestle matches. He screamed through them. Every time he took a headlock, it sounded like he was being murdered in Morse code. If whining was an Olympic sport, Iron Mike would have had more gold than Kurt Angle. Lord Alfred Hayes called his matches like he was narrating a mental breakdown. You could hear the aristocratic pain in his voice every time Mike grunted like a hog caught in an electric fence. Hayes once said on commentary, "He's a bit vocal, isn't he?" Which is British for, "This man sounds like a dying goat getting a prostate exam." But wait, it wasn't just the noise. This man had heat backstage. Why? Because he refused to shower. Legitimately. For weeks. Guys were spraying deodorant like they were decontaminating a chemical spill. You didn't work a match with Iron Mike Sharp. You survived him. He wore that black forearm brace for like 15 years. Nobody ever checked it. Nobody cared. At some point, it started to smell like his career. Dead, padded, and full of excuses. He was the loudest loser in the whole of the WWF. He was the first guy who could oversell a lockup and still underdeliver a promo. Watching Sharp wrestle was like watching your drunk uncle try to get off the couch without farting. To Lord Alfred Hayes, Iron Mike wasn't a worker. He was a punishment, a cautionary tale in boots. They say jobbers don't get remembered. Mike Sharp did, but only because his stench lingered longer than his legacy. Imagine walking into the World Wrestling Federation with the poise of a royal butler and realizing you're surrounded by cartoon convicts, shrieking jobbers, pig cops, and men who use hedge clippers like diplomas. That was Lord Alfred Hayes' daily life in the WWF. A cultured, sharp-witted technician. Alfred Hayes had grace. These guys had gimmicks. Alfred had wit. They had foam props. He didn't just call matches. He narrated chaos like David Attenborough watching a zoo riot. But what made Alfred legendary wasn't his disdain. It was his restraint. In a world full of sideshows, Lord Alfred Hayes was the last ringmaster, and everybody else? They were just the animals throwing their own shit. God save the Queen, and God help the locker room that had to follow Lord Alfred's eye roll. Like, comment, share, subscribe. If this roast left a mark, do the right thing. Slap that like button, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who deserves the burn. More heat coming soon. Thanks for watching. He was the voice of a generation and the brawn of an earlier one. With a booming presence and a heart just as large, Gorilla Monsoon was one of the most beloved figures in professional wrestling history. For fans who grew up in the 1980s and early 1990s, Gorilla wasn't just an announcer, he was the announcer. He was the steady voice in the chaos, the moral compass in a world of backstabbing heels and heroic babyfaces. But before he was the voice behind the mic, Gorilla Monsoon was a rough and tough grappler, a towering force who ruled the ring in the 60s and 70s. Born Robert Morella in 1937, the man who would become Gorilla Monsoon started out in amateur wrestling and shot to prominence in the professional circuit thanks to his enormous size, nearly 400 pounds, and surprisingly agile skill set. Nicknamed the Manchurian Giant early in his career, he eventually embraced the persona of Gorilla Monsoon, a snarling, monstrous heel who dominated opponents with brute force and savage intensity. He'd eventually transitioned to beloved color commentator and backstage authority, partnering with the likes of Bobby the Brain Heenan and Jesse the Body Ventura. But don't let the warm chuckles and lighthearted banter fool you. Gorilla Monsoon had seen it all behind the curtain. As an executive in the World Wrestling Federation and right-hand man to Vince McMahon Sr. and later Jr., Monsoon had pull and opinions. He was widely respected, if not feared, in the locker room, not because he was cruel or cutthroat, but because Monsoon didn't play games. He had a no-nonsense approach to business, a soft spot for old-school values, and a distinct intolerance for ego-driven drama. While Monsoon could be patient and mentoring to many, there were a few wrestlers he just couldn't stand working with. Whether it was their attitude, their style, or their complete disregard for locker room etiquette, these men got on Gorilla's bad side, and it showed. Let's pull back the curtain and explore the fascinating, lesser-known side of Gorilla Monsoon, the part of him that could make or break your career, especially if you rubbed him the wrong way. Gorilla Monsoon had the patience of a saint when it came to rookies, but even he had limits, and the Ultimate Warrior tested every one of them. There was no doubt Warrior had the it factor, a chiseled physique, unbridled energy, and a look that screamed main event superstar. Vince McMahon loved him, fans adored him. But backstage, he was a walking tornado of ego, bad timing, and chaos. Monsoon, who by the late 1980s was doing more backstage work and commentary than wrestling, found Warrior's unpredictable nature infuriating. Warrior was notorious for blowing off agent instructions, forgetting spots, and endangering other wrestlers with his reckless in-ring behavior. Worse still, he had no grasp of the unspoken locker room hierarchy, and that didn't sit well with Gorilla. According to former WWE producer Bruce Pritchard, Monsoon once said Warrior wasn't just green, he was neon. Gorilla had little time for wrestlers who didn't respect the craft, and Warrior's meteoric rise, fueled more by charisma than skill, seemed to embody everything Monsoon disliked about the changing industry. Their backstage confrontations weren't exactly explosive, but there was a visible frost in Gorilla's demeanor whenever Warrior was mentioned on commentary. Monsoon would praise his strength, but often mask subtle digs within his classic phrases like, "This guy doesn't have a clue where he is," or "What a miscarriage of justice." Nails was involved in one of the most notorious behind-the-scenes incidents in wrestling history, a real-life assault on Vince McMahon in 1992 over a pay dispute. Gorilla Monsoon, who was not only close to Vince Sr. but fiercely loyal to the company, took the incident personally. Monsoon was reportedly in the building when Nails attacked Vince and had to be physically restrained by other personnel from going after the former prison guard gimmick himself. Monsoon didn't care if Nails felt wronged. He saw the attack as disgraceful and unprofessional. In later interviews, Monsoon would never explicitly mention Nails, but those close to him, including wrestlers like Jim Ross and Pat Patterson, confirmed Monsoon considered him scum and blacklisted him from any future bookings. Gorilla didn't just dislike Nails, he detested him. Once you crossed that kind of line, there was no redemption in Monsoon's eyes. At one point, Monsoon had great respect for Hossein Khosrow Ali Vaziri, better known as the Iron Sheik, a legitimate Olympic-level grappler and gifted heel. Sheik had carved out a special place for himself in the industry. But as the years went on, his erratic behavior, substance issues, and explosive temper wore thin on Gorilla's patience. Monsoon was part of the brass that had to deal with Sheik's erratic no-shows and drunken outbursts in the mid-1980s. There were times Sheik would arrive at events barely coherent, or get into heated arguments with other wrestlers backstage. What really irked Gorilla was the sense that Sheik was throwing away his potential. Monsoon believed in respecting the business and taking care of your opponents. Watching Sheik decline from a world-class heel to a walking liability was, to him, a betrayal of everything they had once stood for. Though never publicly hostile, Monsoon would often refer to Sheik as unpredictable in all the wrong ways during commentary and backstage meetings. Their professional relationship eventually dissolved into a begrudging tolerance at best. This one might come as a surprise. Special Delivery Jones and Gorilla Monsoon were actually friends outside the ring, and their careers overlapped in the 1970s and 80s, but sometimes even a friend can drive you up the wall. SD Jones was a beloved babyface and enhancement talent, known for his bright smile and colorful personality, but Monsoon reportedly grew frustrated with SD's laid-back approach to in-ring psychology and preparation. He wasn't lazy, just inconsistent. Jones had a tendency to ad-lib or veer from planned match structures, which could throw off timing and confuse opponents. Monsoon, who believed in crisp execution and professionalism, often had to clean up the mess on commentary or backstage in production meetings. While it never turned into an open feud, Monsoon once told a young agent, SD never met a spot he couldn't forget. Bad News Brown was a genuine tough guy with Olympic judo credentials and a chip on his shoulder the size of Brooklyn. Monsoon respected Brown's legit background, but their philosophies on the business couldn't have been more different. Brown famously refused to sell for certain wrestlers or do jobs he didn't agree with. He saw pro wrestling less as entertainment and more as a survival contest. That lone wolf attitude made him difficult to book, and difficult for Monsoon to manage. Monsoon believed in putting the show first. Do business, get paid, get out, was the old school mantra. Bad News Brown saw it differently. If he felt he was being disrespected, he'd walk, or worse, he'd shoot. The tension between the two peaked in the late 80s during Brown's short-lived main event push. Gorilla, by then deeply involved in production, reportedly vetoed several storyline pitches involving Brown due to his unwillingness to cooperate with others. He told one producer, "I won't waste airtime on a guy who won't play ball." What's clear in all these stories isn't that Gorilla Monsoon was some grumpy old gatekeeper clinging to the past. It's that he believed in respect. Respect for the business, respect for your fellow workers, respect for the fans. The men who got under his skin most weren't necessarily the worst wrestlers, but the ones who dismissed that code of honor. Monsoon wasn't petty. He didn't hold grudges for no reason. If you came to work, did your job, and cared about the product, Gorilla would have your back. But if you were sloppy, arrogant, or made a mockery of the craft, you'd feel the cold shoulder of one of the most powerful voices in the company. It's worth noting that Monsoon also mentored dozens of stars, many of whom went on to become legends. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Randy Savage, they all had Monsoon's respect because they respected the business. Even Bobby Heenan, his longtime commentary foil, once said, "Gorilla would rib you, bury you on commentary, and then buy you dinner after the show, if you were one of the boys. But if you weren't, he made it clear." Gorilla Monsoon passed away in 1999, leaving behind a legacy that stretched from the ring to the broadcast booth to the boardroom. His voice is immortal, his presence still felt. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies in the standards he upheld. Wrestling was real to Gorilla, not in the break kayfabe sense, but in the sense that it mattered. The passion, the performance, the professionalism, it mattered. And if you didn't treat it with the same reverence, Gorilla Monsoon would let you know. With just a look, a sigh, or maybe a classic one-liner. Give me a break, will ya? Well, that's all we've got time for today, and a big thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our future content. See you in the next video. In the world of professional wrestling, there were titans in the ring, icons on the microphone, and legends that defined an era. But there was only one man who stood between chaos and control, one voice that brought order to the madness. He wasn't throwing punches, but he was landing every word with precision. He was the master of the microphone, the backbone of every unforgettable promo, the man who could make you believe every word, no matter how outrageous. He was Mean Gene Okerlund. Tonight, we take a look at the life and legacy of the greatest interviewer in wrestling history, the man behind the mic, the voice of generations, Mean Gene. Welcome all to another heated debate where we settle once and for all the legacy of one of wrestling's most iconic figures, the incomparable Mean Gene Okerlund.
Incomparable? Simon, I compare him to my Uncle Roy, and let me tell you, Uncle Roy once announced bingo night at the VFW Hall with more enthusiasm than Mean Gene ever had.
Oh, would you stop? We're talking about the voice of an era. Mean Gene Okerlund was more than an announcer. He was the soul of professional wrestling journalism, a master of the microphone, and the man who could hold his own against the biggest personalities in the business.
Journalism? Please! That guy stirred up more drama than a cage match between two angry ex-wives. I mean, if you gave Mean Gene a microphone, he was either setting up a confrontation, blowing the roof off an arena, or asking Hulk Hogan for the 100th time, "What you gonna do?"
That's exactly why he was great. But before he was the most recognizable voice in wrestling, he was honing his craft in the American Wrestling Association, the AWA. That's where Mean Gene built his reputation as one of the best in the business.
Oh sure, the AWA, the land of forgotten dreams. Remind me, what was their claim to fame again? Besides being the best feeder system Vince McMahon ever had?
Have some respect. The AWA was one of the premier wrestling promotions in the country, and Mean Gene was a crucial part of it. He started as a radio guy in Minneapolis before getting a shot with Vern Gagne's promotion in the early 70s. He wasn't just another face behind the mic, he became the trusted voice of the AWA.
So what you're saying is, he went from spinning polka records to calling wrestling matches? That's like going from being a waiter to running a 5-star restaurant.
Exactly. And he made it work. At first, he was just a backup announcer, filling in when necessary. But when Marty O'Neill, the AWA's original announcer, started stepping away from the business, Mean Gene took over, and guess what? The transition was seamless. His ability to connect with wrestlers and fans made him stand out immediately.
Yeah, because nothing screams future Hall of Famer like filling in for a guy who wanted to retire.
You don't get it. Gene had this natural ability to make interviews feel important. He wasn't just asking questions, he was elevating the talent. When Bobby Heenan was in the AWA managing guys like Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens, Mean Gene was right there, giving those interviews an extra spark.
Oh, now I get it. Mean Gene was the guy who made sure Bockwinkel's 15-minute speeches didn't put the audience to sleep. Bravo!
He did more than that. The AWA was filled with some of the greatest talkers in the business. Heenan, Bockwinkel, Jesse Ventura, Mad Dog Vachon, and Gene kept up with all of them. He was the glue that held those promos together. He even got in on the action a few times himself.
Oh, let me guess. He put on a pair of trunks and wrestled Vern Gagne in a 60-minute Iron Man match?
Not quite, but he did have a match. In 1983, Mean Gene actually teamed up with Hulk Hogan against Mr. Fuji and George the Animal Steele in the AWA. It was a spectacle. The crowd loved it because they respected Mean Gene. They saw him as part of the show, not just some faceless announcer.
Oh, great. So now we're pretending Mean Gene was a top draw? Next, you'll tell me he was responsible for Hogan's rise to superstardom.
In a way, he was. When Hulk Hogan first exploded in the AWA, Mean Gene was the guy who made his promos sound larger than life. He gave them legitimacy. And when Hogan left for the WWF, guess who followed? Mean Gene. Vince McMahon knew that if he wanted to make his national expansion work, he needed the best interviewer in the game.
So you're saying Vince McMahon looked at Mean Gene and said, "That's the missing piece to my empire?"
I'm saying Mean Gene was a key part of the puzzle. When the WWF took off in the 1980s, it wasn't just the wrestlers who made it happen. It was the entire presentation. And Mean Gene, with his professionalism and charisma, was an essential part of that presentation. Without him, wrestling interviews wouldn't have been the same.
All right, I'll admit, he had a presence. And yeah, maybe without him, some of those classic AWA promos wouldn't have hit the same. But let's not pretend he was out there taking bumps every night.
He didn't need to. He took verbal bumps. He got berated by Mad Dog Vachon, talked circles around Heenan, and kept a straight face through some of the wildest interviews in history. And that's why, when Vince McMahon came calling, it was a no-brainer for Mean Gene to jump ship. The WWF needed a voice that could bring credibility to the madness.
And what a madness it was. But I'll say this. Mean Gene took what he learned in the AWA and made himself a legend in the WWF. Even I can't argue that. But let's face it, if he had stayed in the AWA, we wouldn't be talking about him right now.
That's true, but that's because the wrestling business was changing. The AWA didn't evolve, and Mean Gene knew he had to go where the future was. But let's not forget, he made his name in the AWA first. That's where he earned his reputation as the best in the business, and that's why Vince McMahon wanted him in the WWF. Mean Gene wasn't just another announcer, he was the announcer. And it all started before he ever stepped foot in a WWF ring.
Fine. I'll give him his due. But if we start talking about Lord Alfred Hayes next, I'm out of here.
When Mean Gene debuted in the WWF in 1984, it was like wrestling got a voice upgrade overnight. Suddenly, every promo had more polish, every interview had more energy, and every big moment felt even bigger.
Oh sure, because the wrestlers weren't already screaming their lungs out, right?
It's not about volume, it's about delivery. Mean Gene knew how to guide interviews, when to ask the right questions, and when to let the talent shine. He had legendary chemistry with guys like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior.
Oh yeah, those Warrior interviews were something else. Well, you know, Mean Gene, the spaceship has landed, the gods have spoken, and the stars are aligning in the galactic sun. And Mean Gene just nodded along like that made any sense.
That's because he was a pro. He kept things grounded so the audience could actually stay engaged. And let's not forget, he was the master of reaction shots. A raised eyebrow, a skeptical glance. Mean Gene could say more with a single look than some announcers could in an entire promo.
I'll give you that. His expressions during those Jake Roberts and Ric Flair promos were priceless.
Exactly. And he wasn't just a backstage interviewer, he was an on-screen personality. He hosted Primetime Wrestling, All-American Wrestling, and countless event countdowns. His presence was just as crucial to WWF's production as the wrestlers themselves.
And who could forget his bloopers? Like when the sign fell behind him during SummerSlam '89 and he blurted out an expletive on live TV.
And fans loved him for it. Because Mean Gene wasn't just a character, he was real. That's why, when he did those legendary Event Center updates, people paid attention. They trusted Mean Gene.
All right, I'll admit it. The guy was one of a kind.
More than that, he was the best ever to do it. Mean Gene Okerlund wasn't just an announcer, he was a part of wrestling history.
Fine, you win this round. But if we debate Tony Schiavone next, I'm bringing a folding chair.
But nothing lasts forever, and by the mid-1990s, Mean Gene's time in the WWF was winding down. The business was changing, and when WCW started throwing big money at top talent, Mean Gene made the jump in 1993.
Oh, and let me guess. WCW thought signing an announcer would turn the tide in the Monday Night Wars?
He was more than an announcer. Mean Gene brought legitimacy. WCW was trying to compete with the WWF, and they needed familiar faces. Having him conduct interviews with guys like Ric Flair, Sting, and the NWO gave the product an extra layer of credibility.
Yeah, because nothing says credibility like him constantly plugging that WCW hotline.
Okay, so maybe he did a little extra promoting. But his presence in WCW helped them during their rise to dominance in the late 90s. And when wrestling started declining in the early 2000s, he made his way back home to WWE.
Oh yeah, right back into the nostalgia section.
And why not? WWE knew fans loved Mean Gene. They brought him back for special events, nostalgia interviews, and even made him a Hall of Famer in 2006. His induction speech was one of the best ever.
Yeah, because nobody could tell stories like Mean Gene.
Exactly. Even in retirement, he never stopped being part of the wrestling family. Whether it was hosting WWE specials, appearing in video games, or giving interviews, Mean Gene was always in demand. Right up until his passing in 2019, he remained the beloved voice of an entire generation. On January 2nd, 2019, the wrestling world lost one of its most legendary voices when Mean Gene Okerlund passed away at the age of 76. His death marked the end of an era, as fans and wrestlers alike mourned the loss of a man who had given so much to the business. WWE honored him with a touching tribute, with Hulk Hogan delivering an emotional eulogy on Raw. Tributes poured in from all corners of the industry, from Ric Flair to Steve Austin, all recognizing that there would never be another Mean Gene. Even in death, his legacy remains alive, as his work continues to be celebrated by wrestling fans old and new. So, what's the final verdict on Mean Gene Okerlund?
I'll tell you what it is. He was overrated. There, I said it. All he did was hold a microphone while wrestlers yelled at him.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Mean Gene wasn't just holding a microphone, he was creating magic. His voice, his professionalism, his ability to make every interview feel like a major event. No one did it better.
All right, fine, he had a good run. But was he really that important?
Are you kidding me? Without Mean Gene, wrestling interviews would have been a mess of incoherent screaming. He gave order to chaos, structure to insanity, and he made fans believe in the larger-than-life personas of the superstars.
I suppose you've got a point. He did have some legendary moments.
Exactly. Whether it was calling out Ric Flair's antics, keeping a straight face while the Ultimate Warrior rambled about the cosmos, or standing beside Hulk Hogan during some of wrestling's most iconic promos, Mean Gene Okerlund was irreplaceable.
All right, I'll give it to you. The guy was a legend. Happy now?
Ecstatic. And now, I think it's time we toast to the man himself. Here's to Mean Gene Okerlund, the greatest interviewer in the history of professional wrestling. Well, that's all for today, folks. Join us next time as we debate another legend of the squared circle.
And until then, have a great day.